Pat Torres. Welcome to The Story. You know, you may have heard that an Oregon man is suspected in the killings of 4 different women and that he got out of prison early because Oregon Governor Kate Brown cut his sentence short. It's a bit more complicated than it sounds, but it also does highlight the issue of recidivism. People convicted of crimes who do their time then later get arrested for a new crime. We're going to dig into that issue tonight. It's our big story. 4 women in our region were murdered relatively recently, and police say the deaths are connected. While investigators have not yet arrested anyone, we know they have a person of interest in the case. Willamette Week has reported his name is Jesse Calhoun. Calhoun has a criminal record in Oregon and was actually serving time before the women were killed, but he had the sentence commuted by Governor Kate Brown after he worked as an inmate crew fighting the 2020 wildfires. That point caught the attention of many of you. It also raised questions about how often an inmate reoffends after being released from custody. Now, we love to dig into data on this show, so that's exactly what we asked investigative reporter Evan Watson to do.
The reality is that being involved in criminality, sometimes it's, you're going to have some stumbles along the way to try to desist from crime.
Ken Sanchagrin leads Oregon's Criminal Justice Commission, the agency that tracks recidivism, or how often a convicted criminal goes on to commit a new crime.
We normally look at 3 years because it takes some time once folks are out to ensure that they're able to, comply with the rules of society.
The most recent numbers tell part of the story. About half of all people on parole or post-prison supervision in Oregon were arrested again within 3 years. More than a third of them were convicted for new crimes, and about 14% were sent back to jail or prison. If those numbers seem high, they're about 10% lower than the national average, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics.
We do feel like we're leaders in the country as far as reentry services in many cases. We still have a long ways to go, as evidenced by the numbers, but compared to some other states, we do feel like we're a little bit better positioned there.
Right now, recidivism rates in Oregon are at or near historic lows. The CJC found that Measure 110 and the decriminalization of drugs lowered recidivism rates by about 1 to 5% across the 3 categories, a smaller decrease than many thought they'd find, and not enough to account for the entire drop. And while lower recidivism rates might seem like good news, it's not necessarily because people are reoffending less often. They might not be getting arrested or convicted due to a shortage of police officers and public defenders.
We've heard from our law enforcement partners the difficulties they have in hiring, and so enforcement is something that is likely down. We had court slowdowns during the pandemic as well.
Sanchagrin says it's best to look at new convictions to measure success and failure in recidivism. That rate stands at 35% right now. He says investment in rehabilitation is how to lower it.
I think that it really demonstrates there needs to be continued support for reentry programs, for monitoring, for skill development. It's tough to take somebody and to not provide them with enough services when they first come out and expect them to do really well. But the more services we can wrap around folks, then the better outcomes we can expect.
We started looking at Oregon's recidivism data for context on the investigations into the killings of 4 women around Portland. So let's back up. During the pandemic, then Governor Kate Brown commuted the sentences of more than 1,000 inmates. Most were medically vulnerable or had only a few months left on their sentences. Brown also gave 1-year sentence reductions to 41 inmates who helped fight wildfires in 2020. One of those inmates was Jesse Calhoun. He was released 11 months early in the summer of 2021. We checked the records of the 41 wildfire inmates. 10 of them have been arrested for new felonies in the last 2 years. That doesn't include Calhoun, who's not been charged in connection with the deaths. The data, though, isn't directly comparable to recidivism statistics. While some inmates were released early, others had longer time to serve, so their sentences were just reduced. And while the Criminal Justice Commission is studying the recidivism of the hundreds of inmates Brown helped release in 2020, Sanchagrin tells me his office likely won't study the 41 wildfire inmates. He says it's a smaller pool and few cases can skew the numbers, plus the staggered release times, Pat. They add to a lot of the variables in tracking stuff like that.
So that's interesting. You also mentioned recidivism under Measure 110 was less of a drop than they expected it to be. What did they expect?
Yeah, the Criminal Justice Commission studied that when 110 was put in place, saying, hey, we might see some major effects here. The official report said 1 to 5%. That's kind of summarizing the three categories. Sanchagrin told me it's closer to 1% in a lot of the ways. So what they were directly able to attribute to Measure 110 didn't create as big of a drop-off or a decrease in recidivism as they would have thought based on just the overarching narratives around that. However, that doesn't encompass everything. The lower levels of enforcement, pandemic effects in the courts, public defender shortages, all things that we've talked about here in the story, those all play roles too.
All right, and then we also understand there's a push from Republicans to review more of these inmate firefighters?
Yeah, the 41 there, Republicans have said, hey, we need to look at those and figure out what's going on with the 41 inmate wildfire firefighters and see about their cases, but that doesn't look likely at this point. At least talking to Sanchagrin like I did, he said that, hey, those cases just are so varied and it's hard to compare. What they are doing, they're looking at the vast majority of commutations from Kate Brown's administration and making some determinations from there. We don't have 3-year data because it hasn't been that long since that happened, but the 1-year data shows it's in line or even slightly better than normal recidivism statistics. Nothing outlying at this point.
Okay, interesting. Thank you, Evan Watson. Great reporting as always.
Thanks, Pat.
Exactly 51 weeks ago, so can we call it a year? President Joe Biden signed the CHIPS Act, meant to bring high-tech semiconductor manufacturing back to America.
You know, the CHIPS and Science Act supercharged our efforts to make semiconductors here in America. Excuse me, those tiny computer chips, smaller than a fingertip, that are the building blocks for our modern economy, powering everything from smartphones to dishwashers, automobiles.
Well, the president was pretty fired up about getting such a landmark deal through Congress.
Today is a day for builders. Today, America is delivering. And I honest to God believe that 50, 75, 100 years from now, from people who will look back on this week, they'll know that we met this moment. Today I'm signing the law of the CHIPS and Science Act, a once-in-a-generation investment in America itself, a law that the American people can be proud of.
And so those comments were from a year ago, last August. It's potentially a huge deal for Oregon and its large semiconductor companies, places like Intel, Analog Devices, and others. So let's do a quick review. The act makes available a huge pool of money for semiconductor expansion, $52 billion. Companies can apply for some of it to help fund their expansion of advanced manufacturing in the U.S. The act also includes $24 billion in tax breaks, where companies can apply to get back roughly 25% of what they spend on that expansion. On top of that, Oregon's legislature set aside roughly $500 million in a variety of grants, loans, and incentives to help semiconductor companies expand here. And this week, the governor awarded Intel $90 million, but did not say exactly what it will be used for. Which is why Oregon Senator Ron Wyden held a news conference with other politicians today to celebrate the 1-year anniversary and what is already being done in Oregon. He believes it's already spurred growth amongst the big semiconductors in our state.
Semiconductors have had a banner week in Oregon. If you add up what's happened in the last week alone, the announcement at Intel, major new capital investment in Hillsborough, potential for thousands of new good-paying jobs. Last week, Analog Devices provided the latest example of our state's pivotal role, announcing a $1 billion expansion at the Beaverton campus. Big win for the metro area.
All right. And Intel, by the way, won't say exactly what its expansion plans are, but we did get a look at their air quality permit application. It shows the company expects to double the amount of greenhouse gases that it releases at its factories in Aloha and what used to be called Ronler Acres in Hillsborough. So it's a good guess that it's going to be big, probably really big. Analog Devices announced last week that they would spend $1 billion to expand their semiconductor wafer fab in Beaverton. They sent us these pictures as well. The company currently has about 950 employees in Oregon and says the new investment will mean hundreds more jobs. The company's vice president of fab operations, Fred Bailey, said the CHIPS Act helps a lot.
You know, I want to talk a little bit about the CHIPS Act and Chips and Science Act. You know, what's been done on this really enabled factories, companies like Analog Devices to make these investments for the industry, for the community. And I think if we look, you know, beyond the Chips and Science Act, the tax credits that come along with this. So Senator Wyden, I really want to pass along a thanks from all of Analog Devices in the semiconductor industry. That's a huge part for us.
Okay, so we've seen that the promise of the CHIPS Act money is moving some of these big companies. But has any of that federal money flowed into Oregon or any other state for that matter? I asked Senator Wyden about that today. There's been a lot done by the state as a result of the CHIPS Act, trying to position ourselves for the future. But what have we gotten from the federal government and from the CHIPS Act? Have we gotten a single dollar out of that yet?
Pat, I'll let the companies speak for themselves, but you just heard from Analog, for example, how important those tax credits are. The $24 billion tax credit package that I put together.
Oh, Senator Wyden. That, my friends, is what we call a skillful pivot. The question was, has any CHIPS Act money arrived in Oregon? The answer was tax credit promises have made some companies do things. As a follow-up, the senator's staff reminded me that U of O, OSU, and PSU each got $1 million for research grants that were technically part of the CHIPS Act. Okay, but the big money has not arrived. I'm not trying to be critical. I just wonder whatever happened to the bags of money promised by the feds. I emailed the Commerce Department to ask when we could expect to see some of the money, and they were so impressed they ignored me. I did some research, though, and I found out that the government does hope to start announcing winners this fall. We'll be watching to see if any of that actually makes its way to Oregon. Coming up next on The Story, it's been a while since we've reported on any drama involving the Oregon Liquor and Cannabis Commission, or OLCC. Oh, but that's going to change tonight. The former director of the agency has filed paperwork to explore a lawsuit against Governor Kotek. How this all ties back to some campaign donors and a series of events that ultimately led to the resignation of former Secretary of State Shemia Fagan. All that and more when The Story returns. The former head of the Oregon Liquor and Cannabis Commission says Governor Kotek fired him because she was urged to do so by a campaign donor and controversial figure in the cannabis industry. At least that's according to this tort claim notice that was filed last week. The paperwork is the first step in filing a lawsuit against the state government. Steve Marks claims that Kotek fired him earlier this year because he had upset Rosa Cazares, co-owner of La Moda, that's a cannabis dispensary, in fact there's lots of them, who is prominent Kotek donor. You might remember Cazares' name from the controversy surrounding former Secretary of State Shemia Fagan. Her $10 grand a month contract with La Moda is what eventually led to Fagan's resignation. Mark's paperwork notes a case from 2018 when the OLCC, under his leadership, cited one of Cazares' companies for mishandling nearly 150 pounds of cannabis. Marks claims that after that, Cazares and her partner began making major donations to state Democrats as a way to influence state cannabis policy in their favor. It's important to note that there is no lawsuit yet. And, by the way, the document does not offer any evidence linking Mark's firing to Kotek's connection with Cazares. Instead, it runs through a timeline of events that Mark's attorney suggests does show Cazares' influence on the governor. The attorney wrote, "It is evident that Governor Kotek pushed Marks out of office because Cazares made it known, either directly or through then-Secretary Fagan, that she wanted him gone and had paid the financial cost to see those plans bear fruit." It went on. In short, because Marks supported and carried out regulations that Cazares saw as onerous, she bought his ouster through financial graft. When Kotek has been asked about Marks' firing, she said it was time for change. Marks worked as the director of the OLCC since 2013. The governor told the Oregonian in May that she fired Marks because she wanted new leadership at the agency. But the timing of when she asked for his resignation does kind of raise a bit of a question. It happened, you see, in late January, but that was well after Kotek had already told other agency directors they would not be part of her new administration. The Oregonian reports that the heads of the lottery and the emergency management office were told in December that they'd be let go. So there was quite a delay there. It's worth noting the Bourbon Gate controversy had not yet been revealed when she asked for Marks' resignation. So why wait to tell Marks he was done? Time and a potential lawsuit will tell. And by the way, there is one more odd wrinkle in this story. Yesterday, the executive director of Oregon Recovers said he is actually the one who asked Kotek to fire Marks, and that he had done so twice. Mike Marshall claims that many people in the public health field wanted Marks gone because he said the Marks did nothing to protect Oregonians from alcohol addiction and instead turned the OLCC into an agency promoting liquor consumption. So there's that. Now, what do you think about all this? Do you think Steve Marks might have a case if he moves forward with a lawsuit? Or do you think the governor had every right to ask Marks to step down as she crafted her new administration? Email us, will you? The address is thestory@kgw.com, or call and leave a voicemail, 503-226-5090. Now, on yesterday's show, we told you about a plan from the mayor of Anchorage, Alaska, to buy one-way plane tickets for homeless people in his city to get them out of there. The goal is to get them somewhere warmer before the frigid winter, and ideally to connect them with family members who would help them get back on their feet. It's still not clear if that plan will come to fruition due to a lot of pushback and no funding for it just yet. But it also allowed us to explore other places where a program like that is in place, including right here in Portland, Oregon. The Ticket Home program is actually still going on here today. The organization Transition Projects heads it up. They're the largest provider of homeless shelter services in Multnomah County, according to the county's website. As far as the requirements to get travel paid for, people have to give contact information for whoever they're going to stay with, and that host has to verify a minimum 3-month stable housing plan. And as long as the host returns some signed paperwork that's mailed to them, well then, it's a done deal. Today we asked Transition Projects for some numbers on how often the Ticket Home program is used. They have not gotten back to us. But last night we asked for your comments about programs like that. Is it good to try and reconnect homeless folks with loved ones, or are they sort of smoke screens, these programs, to ship people out to other cities so that they can deal with them? We definitely did hear back from you. A viewer named Valerie thinks it's great.
Yes, I do believe that giving homeless people a bus ticket to somewhere where they have support and a place to live is an excellent idea. It is part of a solution. It is not a distraction. It is part of the solution of our crisis of a problem. I am all for it.
All right, thanks for that input, Valerie. Brad wrote to us to say the answer to the homeless problem should be family, not housing first. The probability is that many of the homeless have family that have given up on them for other problems that are part of their lives. If unsheltered people believe they have a better support network in another place, why would we be unwilling to supply the transportation needed that would get them to that place? But not everyone was on board, with one viewer suggesting that the person's family or loved ones should be paying for the travel, not taxpayers or some other organization.
I do not think that's a good idea. I think the best idea it will be for whoever is going to help them, they can buy a ticket for them to come home. So that would be, for me, an accurate way to really, with good intention, help them.
Thanks to all of you for your comments. You always make the show better when you give us your feedback. Coming up next on The Story, a payroll tax set to take effect in Salem next summer after City Council vote. But citizens there say not so fast. They want to vote on it themselves. There's a petition to get it on the ballot this year, and we have an update on their signature gathering efforts and why even they say there could be some invalid names on that list. That's coming up next when The Story returns. Last month, Salem residents filled city council meetings to oppose a city payroll tax that's meant to help fill a $19 million shortfall for city services. Despite the opposition, council narrowly approved the tax that's set to begin next summer. Here's a brief run through of what you need to know about that. Anyone who works within the Salem city limits and makes more than minimum wage will be taxed. And the tax would be 0.814%, so just less than 1%. It'd raise an estimated $28 million a year. Someone making roughly $62,000 a year would pay about $500 total if they worked 5 days a week in Salem. After it passed the Salem City Council, many of you wrote to us saying citizens should be able to vote on a tax plan like this. The city said, well, of course you can. In 2031, 7 years after they start collecting the tax, well, you can bet the reaction was pretty fierce. So much so that the Salem-based Oregon Business and Industry Trade Association filed a petition to put the issue to voters this November. Now, the group needs just under 4,000 valid signatures by August 9th, a week from today. As of Tuesday afternoon, though, they told us they already have over 10,000 signatures. As great as that sounds for those of you who want to vote on the issue this year, the group says there could be a high number of invalid signatures due to confusion over who is exactly eligible. The president and CEO of Oregon Business and Industry put it this way. For example, a lot of voters have Salem addresses but do not live within technically the city limits. So even if those folks work within the city and are subject to the tax, their signature would still be invalid. The group tells us that they will continue to gather signatures for the next week to ensure that they meet the threshold of valid signatures of voters who live within the city limits. And we'll be keeping a close eye on their campaign to see if they can turn their opposition into action and change, perhaps, in November. Now, if you'd like to learn more about their plan, you can visit the website there on your screen, letsalemvote.com. Before we go tonight, a quick programming note regarding tomorrow. Here's a look at the afternoon lineup. We will not have a show for you because it's already time for NFL preseason football. But you can bet we'll be right back here on Friday with everything you love about the story. And that's the end of our show for today. But remember, the story, our collective story, well, that never ends. Stick around now for the good stuff coming your way next, and I'll see you right back here on Friday at 6:30.